Hello, and welcome to the second webinar of the Fit for Food 2030 webinar series, titled Cities as Change Agents, Building Competencies for Future Food Systems. You can find the first webinar of this series entitled RRI in the Food System on the Fit for Food 2030 website. My name is Catherine Bongard, and I work at UFIC, and with our colleagues at ILSI Europe, we have developed this webinar series as part of the project Fit for Food 2030. I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. In this second webinar, we will explore the importance and the challenges of local engagement in order to transform EU food systems. It will give you a broad perspective of what cities can do to contribute to a more future-proof food system. Before we get started, and for those of you who are on Twitter, you can follow us on @SciFoodHealth and tweet using the hashtags on the screen, hashtag FIT4FOOD2030 or hashtag Food2030EU. In addition, we'll be running a live Q&A session after all our presentations. So please submit your questions in the Ask a Question feature located at the bottom of your screen. If you have any specific questions for one of our speakers, please be sure to write their name so that we can delegate them accordingly. All the webinars will be recorded and made available through the registration page and the Fit for Food 2030 website. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Roberta Sonino, who is a professor and the director of Impact and Engagement at the School of Geography and Planning at Cardiff University. Roberta works across the research policy interface and has renowned expertise in food politics with a particular focus on urban food strategies, food security, and a host of other topics. Roberta's presentation today is about cities as change agents.
Hello, everybody, and many thanks for the invitation to this really exciting seminar. I have been asked to speak about cities as agents of change, hence I thought I'd start my presentation with an illustration of the type of change that I think we need. On the right-hand side of this slide, you see a quite old figure now, 10 years old figure produced by colleagues from Oxford University. That is, in my view, a very compelling synthesis of the core challenge we face. That is the relationship between food and nutrition security and socio-environmental security. In other words, the relationship between levels of income and employment, the availability of flows and stocks of natural resources, and the ability of a population to feed itself healthily. For me, this figure is the background that makes the adoption of a systemic approach more than ever urgent. Simply put, in my view, our progress in the global fight against food insecurity and malnutrition will ultimately depend on our capacity to holistically engage with this complex picture, what is commonly known as systems thinking. Systems thinking has been defined as the recognition that complex issues are linked, there are multiple actors in the system and they are connected, and integrated solutions are then required. When we talk about cities as agents of change, we need to keep in mind that to date, the best practical examples of application of systems thinking have indeed emerged in cities, where the interdependent pressures that shape food insecurity and malnutrition very often tend to converge. Two main types of urban innovations connected with systems thinking. In some cases, a systemic approach to food has inspired the establishment of multi-actor food policy and advocacy coalitions, the so-called food policy councils. Whereas in other cases, systems thinking has translated into the design of more joined up, more integrated food policies, or even circular food economies, which also have emerged in cities. And I want to spend a few seconds thinking about circular food economies, because for me, in many ways, they epitomize the central tenets of systemic food thinking. Circular food economies emphasize use rather than exchange value. And this fundamental requirement that regulates their economic transactions raises the need for regular exchanges of knowledge between key actors. Use value can only be defined through collaboration, through collective reflection. Hence, the need for strong collaborative relations between key actors and hence spatial proximity. The most interesting dimension of circular food economies for the purpose of my presentation today is that they originate short supply chains, and I'll come back to this later on. Now, the big question is, what are the challenges that city governments are facing when they try to scale up or scale out these food innovations? What exactly do we need to do to make sure that these innovations are not just confined to urban areas, but bring about wider systemic food change? I will mention today 4 main challenges that are often interconnected with one another. Challenges about knowledge and research, challenges about investment, regulation, legislation. Let me start with knowledge. As researchers to date, we have very much focused our attention in the field of urban food systems on examples of best practice. We have very much relied on the performative power of case studies, which have quickly made some cities become emblematic for food system innovation, cities like Toronto in Canada, Belo Horizonte in Brazil. We know a lot about those cities by now. What we don't know is why systemic food thinking doesn't emerge in other cities. And failure to produce this knowledge is dangerous. It's dangerous because it will eventually facilitate the unfolding of yet another uneven global food geography, another uneven geography of winners and losers, leaders and laggards. So the first challenge I'd like to mention is about knowledge. It's about mobilizing the capacity of national governments in particular to create connections between municipal governments that seemingly operate within very similar contexts, very similar socioeconomic and political contexts, but that in reality seem to have differential capacities to act, differential capacities in terms of planning, mayoral influence, data collection. Knowledge also means research. I'm calling here for a new research agenda that moves away from examples of best practice, a new research agenda that also moves away from governance idioms such as resilient or smart cities, idioms that tend to reduce the city to a discrete, abstract spatial category that somewhat exists in isolation prior to or as a background against people's lives. Resilient and smart cities are very useful concepts for performance-based governance and evidence-based policy. But performance-based governance and evidence-based policymaking work in some cities, but not in many others. They don't work, for example, in the cities of the South, where they would be stymied by the pervasiveness of informal economies that provide a major challenge to the quantification of urban food systems for evidence-based policy making. So what I'm saying here is that if we want to avoid exacerbating inter and intra-urban disparities in a global context that's already characterized by uneven power relations, we need a new type of research. We need research that focuses on ordinary practices, how ordinary practices are enacted by citizens who are striving to reconfigure their food environment, and how this is impeded or facilitated by national and global governance modalities. Amongst other things, what I'm calling for here is the development of far more participatory methodologies that draw upon the experiential knowledge of citizens to collect, map, and analyze data, the so-called citizen science. We need, I'm saying it in one word, context-specific information, which is currently absent or insufficient in many cities. Without context-specific information, we will not be able to develop truly progressive food policies and monitor how they translate into enhanced human capacities and entitlements. Another area that needs attention, another big challenge that often falls under the responsibility of national governments is the infrastructure of the food system. I'm thinking here of concepts such as city-region food systems, very much used by FAO in the last few years. Concepts that are drawing attention to the flow of people, material, ecosystem services that entangles urban and rural spaces. If we want to make these flows sustainable, socially, spatially, environmentally sustainable, we need to strengthen the nodal points of the food system. We need to invest in whole-scale markets, food hubs, diversify distribution channels. This investment is vital for the short supply chains to release their potential, the type of short supply chains I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, to release their potential in terms of redistribution of added value, articulation of more inclusive and transparent market governance, and support for local biodiversity, including traditional foods, which are key to diversify diets. Investment as a key entry point, and I want to stress this very clearly, investment is not necessarily about finding additional resources, which would be a major challenge nowadays. Investment could just be a matter of making better use of already available funding, like those connected with public procurement, for example, one of the most powerful economic instruments we have at our disposal to reform the food system holistically. And not just that, we also need to remember that public procurement specifically focuses on vulnerable social groups that are often at high risk of food insecurity and malnutrition, children in schools, patients in hospitals, elderly in care homes, offering also an opportunity for the public sector to reflect its educational and health prevention or promotion messages in the food it provides. So looking into the future, the time has come to really try to create an enabling environment for public procurement, working to support innovative public food systems, particularly in terms of the metric we utilize for the awarding of public contracts, a metric that needs to provide clear incentives to deliver sustainability and food security outcomes, but also in terms of the investment made in capacity and capabilities, again, the infrastructure of a public food system and the specific skills that are needed to utilize it. Public procurement evokes a final challenge I'd like to mention today, a challenge that is also key to resolve if we want to scale up and out urban food system innovations, the challenge of regulation. I think the time has come to find the courage to address some crucial questions about power. And I'm turning to national governments again here, because I think that national governments should start using their powers to contest the role of global agribusinesses and profit-driven multinational conglomerates that continue to shape urban food environments in complicated ways. What this means in practice, it means reorientating international trade as far as possible towards local needs rather than wants, to ensure that small-scale local suppliers don't have to confront an unfair competition with cheap imports. It means also intervention to ensure prompt payments by supermarkets to their suppliers, or more generally, policy intervention to set clear targets towards social and environmental justice, including, by the way, decarbonization targets. In conclusion, what I've tried to say today is that over the last decades, cities have made very important steps towards the application of systemic food policies. As a vital next step to sustain this effort over space and time, we need to work with national governments and build their capacity to recognize their critical function as links between local and global policy action in terms, as I try to explain, of mobilization of knowledge and resources, legislation, and regulation. Without the involvement of national governments, neither local governments nor global food system actors will be able to identify, to initiate, to sustain the type of political and socio-ecological reconfigurations that are really needed, urgently needed, across cities but also across scales to meet the grand challenge of systemic food change.
All right, thank you, Roberto. And apologies for everyone joining in for the sound quality at the start of this webinar. We seem to have fixed it by now, but otherwise do let us know. And this is just a quick reminder that if you have any questions, please submit them in the chat box below the screen. Our next speaker is Christina Paca. She is a project manager at Excite, who is a partner in the FIT4FOOD2030 project. Her presentation is titled The FIT4FOOD2030 City Lab Approach.
So thank you, Catherine, for the introduction. With this presentation, I want to briefly introduce you to the building blocks of the Fit4Food City Lab approach before passing on the floor to colleagues in Barcelona and Sofia, who will in turn render it more concrete for us with examples of their on-the-ground work. As Catherine mentioned, I am part of the Fit4Food consortium, where I help coordinate the project City Labs. As a side note, if you haven't yet had a chance to listen to the first webinar of this series, our coordinator Jacqueline Broers introduces the project and its actions to operationalize the Food 2030 policy framework for future-proof food systems through research and innovation, and it's a good background for the work of the City Labs. To start off, echoing a point that Roberta raised, Fit4Food 2030 also identifies system thinking as a key prerequisite alongside active stakeholder engagement. City Labs are our tangible spaces for experimentation at the city level, where we are trying participatory methodologies to make intentional interventions at the city level, facilitated by host organizations that receive project training and support our City Lab hosts. With them, in this case, the aim has been to build competencies on food system responsible research and innovation, and raise awareness of initiatives and action plans under the Food 2030 framework. Nevertheless, at each location, by taking part in lab processes, stakeholders and citizens are also building their capacity for broader participatory processes in the future. First of all, from whom are we learning? There is a total of 14 city labs coordinated and hosted by a variety of organizations. And what each have in common is their commitment to act as an interface between research and innovation and society, and embed responsible research and innovation RRI principles in their work. While the work of the labs takes many forms, we can still identify a lab approach. So through a series of workshops and bilateral exchanges, events, consultations, the labs focus on building a community of practice. They ask first who needs to be there at the table, mapping interest, influence, but also underrepresentation and the steps needed to overcome that, and how best to mobilize these stakeholders to take ownership of the process. They develop a shared vision and seek to understand the system's leverage points. And with these insights, they sketch out the roadmap. And today you will see two examples. So in terms of competence needs from our colleagues in Sofia, and also more related to R&I agendas from colleagues in Barcelona. The city labs then make a plan for action, ideating, prototyping, and piloting solutions. As part of this process, 18 educational modules have been created, and of course other action plans and projects are in the making as well. At the moment, the labs are considering how they can make the modules, the network, the lessons learned survive, and in which forms. There are still actions ongoing at various points in our scheme. Of course, tools and training have been provided for each step, and we will also make these available soon on the project platform. We have applied this experimentation model so far, in particular to competence building as a first playground. And the audiences that the labs target are quite broad, as you can see, from current to future researchers, professionals, and society at large. They have taken part of a process deriving competencies locally, starting first with a vision of the future-proof food system, and asking then what kind of research and innovation system can help to achieve it, and afterwards, what are the competencies necessary, in this case, competencies that are urgently needed and underrepresented in current offers of education and training that will make this research and innovation system blossom. In addition to these local insights, the project has also provided building blocks based on best practices in the field. For example, so learning with society in a deeper way, which means using real-life challenges in collaboration with real-life stakeholders, and as well hands-on, playful STEAM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and the arts educational practices. The others speak more for themselves, so I won't go into more details. Of course, educational modules are just one of the pathways that the labs are taking. You will hear from colleagues in Barcelona more about the R&I agendas and local action plans. And we see that the labs are also places where local initiatives can be discussed. For example, one of the labs discussed a new food system incubator and local opportunities and threats for this new initiative. In cities where the field is quite active in this area, the lab has profiled itself to support their activities, helping them build capacity and bringing inspiration from a food system approach. Finally, some very short reflections from quite a complex process. The diversity of conditions under which the labs operate means that each has to negotiate its position according to who has agency, what partnerships can form, and so on. In the process of building competencies locally, the labs have stressed the need for repeated long-term commitment so that people can get confident in using system thinking tools and approaches rather than simply raise awareness of them. Of course, this requires a meaningful set of incentives, not just for the training recipients themselves, but also for different stakeholders with whom our training recipients learn. Basically a win-win situation for everybody. And finally, I will close on the note of the importance of creating the right environment that facilitates openness to change. That's all from me. Thank you for your attention.
Many thanks, Christina. So our next speaker is Rosina Malagrida, Head of the Living Lab for Health at IRSI Caixa, and the co-coordinator of the Barcelona La Caixa Living Lab. Rosina will speak to us today about managing the complexities of urban food system transformation in the context of the City Lab in Barcelona.
Well, hello, I'm going to talk to you about how to manage complexity for urban food system transformation through the City Labs and specifically through the City Lab in Barcelona. As you all know, in Fit4Food, we are trying to change the way we solve our problems. We are trying to implement strategies like Food 2030 and other strategies that describe us future visions. And we know that in order to achieve these future visions for our system, we need to apply changes not only in the food system, but also in the research and innovation system. And to do that, we believe in this project that it is essential to create intermediary structures between the two systems, the research and innovation system and the food system. And this is what we call the City Labs. Actually, nowadays, we are already changing the paradigm in the research and innovation system. We are trying to make it more open and more inclusive, with many different movements coming up from the European Commission and from other organizations, where we are trying to better include different stakeholders in the process. So, for example, citizen science or open innovation processes like design thinking, and so many other methodologies and structures like science hubs and living labs that have been created to open up this process. By opening up this process, we expect that our solutions will better scale up and impact the food system, and therefore produce change. However, under this new paradigm, we are still facing a wall. We are still facing that our solutions don't impact the food system as highly as we would expect. And the reason for that is that actually there is a wall which is built with different elements of the system that we are not taking into account during the design of the research and the implementation of the research and during the design and implementation of the innovation. And therefore, what we are exploring in the Barcelona City Lab is how to better take all these elements into account when designing solutions and, of course, interventions for system change. What we have realized is that actually most of the time, or in many times, we are tackling problems without seeing all the components of the problems. So some elements of the system are still hiding under the water, like in this picture. And this is because we tend sometimes to think as problems as if they were complicated, so having rules and having recipes to be solved, instead of thinking about problems as if they have a lot of unknowns and a lot of interrelated factors that may be hindering us from finding appropriate solutions for them. So, what are these elements of the system that are there? What are all these unknowns? What are all these interrelations of the factors that we have in the system that may be making it difficult for us to implement solutions? Well, these elements are very varied, and I have put for you here a list of some possible elements that we need to consider. These elements, they may be found in the phases of the value chain, in the different areas of the systems, in the different levels, in the different sectors, in different academic disciplines, in different research and innovation lines, in different typologies of solutions, and with the perspectives of different stakeholders. And among these different categories, we will have to explore trends, showcases, and research and innovation breakthroughs that are already promoting change in the areas where we believe that change is more urgently needed. But of course, here there is a lot of complexity, and we may be questioning how can we manage this complexity? How can we juggle with all these elements in the system? That's what actually we are doing research on from the City Lab in Barcelona. During this project, we have divided the time in 3 blocks. During the first block, we have been developing knowledge and piloting methodologies to juggle with all these elements in the system, and we have summarized them in the educational model that we have facilitated through the project. The next step will be to implement it through a community of practice in the city of Barcelona. During the first phase of knowledge development, we mainly devoted our time to explore, together with the community of practice, 3 typologies of knowledge. So all the stakeholders in the Barcelona city that were trying to attain a challenge and to think about solutions were invited. Well, not all of them, but a lot of them were invited to workshops where we all together explored system knowledge. So we explored together why is it so difficult to solve the problems we are trying to solve, and we explored together the complexity of the problems we were trying to solve. After that, we explored together target knowledge. So we built together shared visions to describe the future we want to achieve in our city and connected to other levels like national, international, and global level. And finally, we built up transformation knowledge. So we brought into the workshops again different elements of the system, like, for example, elements that are in place in the areas where change is already happening in the direction that we want to achieve, and we put them on the table for the different stakeholders to better explore how transitions are going on and how our transition action plan should be developed. Our next step now is to consolidate this community of practice and to move towards implementation. And to do that, we have signed an agreement with policymakers, with the Barcelona City Council and with La Caixa Foundation. But we know that in this community of practice, it's not like in the previous slides that we saw a linear path from challenge to solutions, but we know that, as Mazzucato suggests in her documents about mission-oriented research, that we need to pay special attention to the coordination among different projects. And we believe that this coordination that Mazzucato suggests has to happen while at the same time exploring the 3 sorts of knowledge that I mentioned before, and we need to do that at different levels, as it's written here in the right of this slide. So for that reason, we are now approaching these communities of practice, trying to consolidate them thanks to this agreement that I mentioned with the Barcelona City Council and La Caixa Foundation and another research center in Barcelona. And with all this, we expect to have better sustainability of the City Lab, future sustainability and impact, but not only for the City Lab, but equally important for all the participants who have participated in the City Lab and who will be participating in the communities of practice. And with them, together with them, we want to have impact in the city strategy. Also, we want to explore which changes need to happen in the strategies of the organizations participating. And also, we want to build together a collective strategy for change in our city. That's what we are planning to do to better impact the future proofing of the European food systems through research and innovation. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Rosina. If any of you have any questions for either Christina or Rosina, please submit them in the chat box below. Our last speaker today is Martina Arabatseva, the City Lab coordinator for the City Lab Sofia in Bulgaria. And Martina will speak about the experiences of City Lab Sofia and using education for change.
Hello, everyone. City Lab Sofia has implemented 2 educational modules until now, one for students in middle school and one for students in elementary. Now we are working on implementing a module for high schoolers. The first step of designing a module is having a vision, which of course is combined with and contributed to with all stakeholders. The next step is to identify the necessary competencies that students need, so this vision would be fulfilled. And afterwards, the prototyping of the module starts. After the structure is ready, we piloted the modules, and then we counted a lot on analyzing the feedback we received from teachers and students in order to improve the elements of the module, some elements of the module, which made the prototyping of the courses a continuous process. In the beginning of the process, a lot of teachers wanted to be part of our City Lab network. So they helped us identify the most pressing needs in the schools and students in Bulgaria, which we talked about with other stakeholders and commented a lot what we can do. After the first piloting sessions, students became very active, and they wanted to reach out to different stakeholders, which we as a City Lab helped them to do. And all of these collaboration led to the results of implementing our modules, the establishment of a food and ecology club, and the participation in different contests. We learned quite a lot during this module piloting. The first lesson we learned was to use existing opportunities and work with the already existing curriculum in public schools, which gave us the opportunity to implement the modules with more students, as well as stimulating them to take part in different contests, which motivated them a lot. Also, we encourage a hands-on approach, which is challenge-oriented, and try to give more experience in project-based approach to students, because this is not very typical for the education in Bulgaria. In order to help the students understand how they could change their daily life through the things they learned, we tried to take things outside the classroom and help them really make changes and have impact. And the very positive aspect of the module implementation is that students receive bonus skills or practical skills which are not necessarily related to the food system, but are very important for every young person, such as applying systematic approach, mentoring between students, or even running a website or preparing a project proposal. A big question for our City Lab since the beginning was how to multiply the results of our work, and what we have thought about now is organizing contests, different discussions, forums, local events in order to present more and more unique teaching approaches and practices. That's why it's also important to invest in teacher training and encourage and fund school projects, as collaboration between projects leads to really good results and scaling up. Also, the optional curriculum is the fastest way we find to introduce new classes in the otherwise rigid program of the public school. And our long-term aim is to represent a different food system aspect throughout every stage of secondary education. Also, it was useful to collaborate with public spaces, in our cases, community gardens, or even just use public spaces to share achievements and work done by the students. That's our ideas of Sofia City Lab until now. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Martina. So now that we've seen all the presentations, I'm going to open the space up for questions. We've already received a few comments and questions in the chat box, so thank you all for doing that. Please do keep sending them along, and I will direct them to the speakers. So our first question goes to Roberta. In your presentation, you mentioned that at the moment it's not very clear why a food systems approach hasn't been adopted in all cities. Do you have an explanation for this? And do you have any suggestions for a way to understand why cities don't adopt this systemic approach to their food challenges?
Well, I think the problem has to do with very established ways of working that promote silo-based approaches to food. System thinking is the exception, unfortunately, and not the norm. It's usually connected with the vision, with the work of food system innovators. And one of the reasons why I advocated for the involvement of national governments is exactly to prevent the isolation of these innovators and make sure that their systemic approaches to food become the norm rather than the exception. So we need to overcome silo-based approaches, silo-based thinking. We need to realize that the solutions to the type of challenges the food system is facing nowadays are not just either supply-driven or demand-driven. We need to connect the dots all across the food system.
Okay, cool. The next question that has come up is for Rosina. And one of our audience members asks, how is the private sector associated with your Living Lab, retailers, mass retailers, and outlets, as well as food processors? Are you there, Rosina? All right, we can also save that question once you come back on.
At the moment, we are implementing our work in 3 different cycles of workshops. In the first, yes? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. You can keep going.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, Rosina, we can hear you.
You can keep going. Okay. Yes. Can you hear me? I was saying that we are implementing our workshops in 3 different cycles of events. And in the first 2 cycles, we have been working with a wide diversity of stakeholders.
Yes, Rosina, we can hear you. You can keep going.
Okay. Can you hear me? I was saying that we are implementing our workshops in 3 different cycles of events. And in the first 2 cycles, we have been working with a wide diversity of stakeholders.
Yes, Rosina, we can hear you. You can keep going.
Okay. Can you hear me? I was saying that we are implementing our workshops in 3 different cycles of events.
For this technical clip, attending.
Yes, I was saying that we are implementing our workshops in 3 different cycles of events.
Sorry again, everyone. We're just trying to deal with this. We just ask that everyone mute. We just ask that everyone mute. Rosina, all right, so we seem to have fixed this problem. Apologies, everyone, for that. I think the live video was going on behind the scenes somewhere. So, Rosina, would you like to answer that question again?
I will try. Yes, thank you. Yeah, I was trying.
Maybe it seems to be coming from your computer. I'll just jump on to the next question real quick, and we can get the technician to look into this. And we will try to get the questions to you so you can answer them written so all the attendees can see your answers. And this next question here is for Christina. What do you think the impact of COVID-19 and similar disruptions is and will be on city region food systems? And do you have any digital means to replace or complement the work that city labs are doing? All right, we seem to, are you on the line, Christina? Otherwise, I'll jump over to another question. This question was for Christina on the phone. All right, I'm just going to jump to the next question because we seem to have a problem there. Martina, if you're still on the line, if someone is interested in setting up their own lab in their own city, do you have an important piece of advice to help them succeed? And where can they find more information about the city labs?
Well, the first piece of advice which I would give is to have a clear process, and it might be useful to implement this Fit for Food process I mentioned earlier, because having a clear idea about the steps you would like to keep will keep your work organized. Also, it's important to find the right people who will support your lab in the best way and not necessarily the stakeholders which are on highest positions. And maybe last but not least, a very important part is to listen to your network, try to implement the ideas you receive from your partners and co-create together with them. I believe that there is information on FIT4FOOD2030 website, and it will be more added. Yeah,
perfect, thanks. And this was also just another thing to add that the Fit for Food project is working on a Tools for Transformation database, which will be live in the upcoming months, which will also give you more information on activities that you can use for city labs. This next question is for Roberta. In your presentation, you explained that context-specific information about cities is required to develop progressive food policies. And do you mind explaining a little bit what you mean by this context-specific information?
I think we need to focus on citizens far more than we have to date. Researchers have been so excited about what city governments were doing to reform their food system that we forgot up to date to look into the real impacts of what city governments are doing on the ordinary lives, on the lived experiences of citizens, which are ultimately or should be the main target of the reform of urban food systems. So context-specific information for me means adopting a place-based approach that takes into account the social, environmental, economic, and cultural dimension that surrounds every city, even when, going back to the previous question, even if a city is thinking about setting up a new lab, they need to understand the context in which they operate, and they need to understand what that context means and entails for ordinary citizens, particularly citizens who live in deprived areas and suffer at high levels of food insecurity, or they suffer from lack of access to healthy food due, as I said in my presentation, to the strength and the power we have given to the private sector to shape urban food environments in complex ways.
Okay, I just have one other question that's come up for Roberta. Stakeholders' engagement and inclusiveness are two necessary principles, but how can you make sure that a large discussion featuring actors with very different interests doesn't prevent effective policy making towards food system transformation? Doesn't this bear the risk for further stagnation and reproduction of the status quo?
I guess this is about stakeholder participation and how we ensure stakeholder participation in the formulation of food policies. Is this what the question is about?
Yes.
Yeah, well, I think I want to stress the one key innovation that city governments, particularly in North America, I have to say, have introduced in this respect, which are food partnerships, food policy networks, particularly food policy councils, which have really given civil society an opportunity, as I've written somewhere, I cannot even remember where, but they've given civil society an opportunity to leave the margins of the governance arena and to become active citizens. It's really, really important that we involve the civil society in the formulation of food policies, because civil society, not only they have a lot of experiential knowledge, as I call it in my presentation, but civil society know where the problems lie. They know where the response gaps are. So no urban food policy, and I want to stress this point with maximum clarity, will ever achieve its sustainability objectives unless it involves civil society. Now, the problem we often find, and this is something that cities need to think about very seriously, in my view, is that the type of civil society that participates through the operation of food policy councils is not necessarily the most disempowered and disadvantaged citizens. So it's important for us to actually make an effort to reach out to people who live in deprived urban areas or people who suffer from high levels of social and economic vulnerabilities. They tend not to come to the meetings of a food policy council. Well, then let's go to them and let's try to listen to them. Let's try to give them some empowerment to reform their food system. Let's not forget that our cities have huge communities of migrants, of refugees, of socioeconomically deprived communities that need to be part of the solution. We cannot continue to overimpose solutions we devise in the ivory tower on them.
Yeah, very true. A quick comment has just come in from Florence that I'd just like to highlight. In case of anyone interested in how coronavirus is impacting the future of our food system and cities, he's just added a link to friendsofeurope.org, and we will include that in the information we'll send out to all the registrants. Otherwise, I will just have a quick question for Martina again. 2 seconds. Martina, so this will probably be the last question for our live session, but we'll make sure that all the questions that you've had will be answered in written form, and we'll send them out to all the audiences. Martina, what has been the most challenging aspect of coordinating or setting up the City Labs?
Thank you for your question. For City Lab Sofia, I would say that one of the biggest challenges was exactly finding the right stakeholders. Maybe in the beginning we tried to find the most influential stakeholders in the city, but throughout the whole process, it appeared that the people who helped us the most and were most engaged in transformation in the food system of the city are not necessarily on the highest position. That's why I mentioned it earlier, and I would like to highlight this. The process and the workshops, the conversations with your stakeholders will help you find the best path for your City Lab. Thank you.
Perfect, thanks. Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for our webinar today, and I just want to apologize again to everyone for these technical difficulties. We didn't get to go through as many questions as we would have liked to, but as I mentioned, we will send out written answers for any questions that were left over from our speakers. So I'd like to thank once again all our speakers for their fantastic presentations, and again, all of you in the audience for joining us. Make sure to register for the third webinar in the Fit for Food 2030 series, which is titled The Farm to Fork Strategy, Research and Innovation as a Catalyst for Food System Transformation. And here during that webinar, we're going to be hearing presentations from the Fit for Food 2030 coordinator, DG Santé, on the Farm to Fork strategy. And these presentations will be followed by a live panel discussion with DG Santé and DG Agri. And this webinar is going to go live next Tuesday, June the 9th at 11 Central European Summer Time. And just quickly, as a final note, we invite you all to tweet what you think you can do to help transform your local food system by using the hashtags that you see on the screen and tweeting @SciFoodHealth. Thanks again. We look forward to hearing from you, and until next time, goodbye.